Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third session on Friday of Culturama. And I'm so excited to have today is for me a day of friends. And one of my best friends is Grant Hier. He's just, and I also find that he's one of the great poets of our time. He won the Prize Americana for Untented Garden. He teaches at Laguna College of Arts and Design. And that's for our students who are thinking about transferring someplace. It's a beautiful campus and a great arts program. And also the first inaugural poet laureate of Anaheim. So he is Disneyland's poet laureate, or was. All right, Grant.
Yeah, I don't know about Disneyland's poet laureate, but I was the poet laureate of Anaheim and the city's literary ambassador. Hey, everybody! Good to see your gray boxes in front of me. Um, good to be here. Culturama is one of my favorite things. I admire the effort put in and what it is and what it represents and all the people involved. The hard workers who brought it up. So I just want to pay props to where we are and what we're doing here. Great community.
So we're going to have an experimental kind of session here, and it's going to go wherever we want it to go. And so I'm going to be interviewing Grant, and we're going to be going in different directions. But I want it not to be just me interviewing Grant. If as we go through, you can ask him questions, and think of this as okay. So Grant is one of the great poetry teachers of Southern California, and now you can kind of ask him whatever you feel like asking him. Those things that you haven't really realized before, you haven't understood before, you've been struggling with. He's a poet who's worked in a lot of different forms, including epic poetry. And there's not a lot of people who can say that, including formal poetry and flash fiction and prose poetry and just all sorts of different forms. Really understands them. I thought I'd just start off the conversation by talking about your nature poetry, because you approach it in a way that's slightly different than most people. So yeah, how do you approach your nature poetry?
Uh, that's that's a great question. I actually was kind of surprised when I was interviewed several years ago, and somebody said, "Well, you're a nature poet," and I went, "I am, really." But yeah, I mean, looking back, I look at my body of work, and I definitely am writing about nature for sure. Um, John, you and I and Donna Hilbert did a panel at Mount Sac, didn't we, on nature? It
Yep.
was along with I'm forgetting the professor's name. In
Ned Widener.
Yeah, there you go. And we were talking about nature and what nature is. Um, in fact, I'm writing out an interview not as we speak, but metaphorically. I've been working the last several days on an interview that where the prompts were given to me, and they ask about a place in nature, an untended garden, which is my first book, and one of the things I'm saying in an interview is what we said at that Mount Sac panel on nature, which is it helps to do the groundwork to understand what we mean by nature. Like, what is it? Um, there's the word artisan and artificial, and we use the word artificial to mean something not man-made. But really, the root of it is made by the artisan, which is artificial because it's not made by nature. It's not naturally occurring in the world. And so there's this mindset of orthodoxy in the worldviews that the religions of the Old Testament and other Orthodox worldviews say that nature is apart from mankind, and nature was created, and then humankind was thrown in, and it exists as something separate from that. And so a lot of literature takes that point of view, and so the artisan, artificial is not nature because there's nature and separate from man, versus the worldview that we are a part of nature, that we sprang up with nature. And so in the old worldview, the Orthodox worldview is, but it was given, nature was given to humankind to have dominion over, and it will always be there as a resource to be exploited as a gift of the Creator, as a gift of God in those myths and religions. Versus we came up and with it, and therefore we are a part of that one organism, and we are the network, and we need to be stewards of ourselves and of nature. So most of my writing, this is a long way around to answer. That's to set up as preface how I approach nature. I approach my nature writing as I do most of my writing. I think it's the similarity between California Continuum, which I co-wrote with you, John, and that is looking for those unseen connections. That we are connected whether we see it or not. And so I love poetry that lets us see in a different way that we might have heard but haven't thought of before. And so when I approach nature writing, I'm looking for those the roots that are running beneath the trees, metaphorically, and that's the central image of some of my a part of my Untended Garden poem. To the mitochondrial Eve, we're connected by a common mother. We all carry a same genetic code by a common mother, which when I found out, it was like, oh yeah, those are the connections we forget about. So when I approach nature writing, I don't sit down to think consciously that I'm going to connect these two things, but sometimes it'll be a fact of nature, or a fact of the connectedness that I'm intrigued by, and I'll just start writing without any intent of what it's going to be. And sometimes it comes out as flash fiction, and sometimes it comes out as poetry. It's just I let the writing determine what it wants to be. So that's part of my process. Does that answer? Did I go off too far on a tangent there?
That's fantastic. Is there a quest in terms of spirituality when you're doing it? Is there an overall, or do you just let that come out as well?
It emerges as it emerges. But I'm always pondering those questions to myself. So I think it finds its way into the poems, if not blatantly implied. My early poetry, my early writing for a long, long time, I was far more heavy-handed and far more declarative. Like, this is how I think, and this is what I think, and in the early poems, even didactic, shaking in the political poems. But I found my natural voice, and I found I was far more effective when I implied that, when I just told the stories and let the reader make the connections. The point being not driven home with a sledgehammer.
Do you have an example of that? Maybe in a recent poem?
Well, I pulled some poems that I had written that are brand new, and I think maybe, yes. I'm going to anybody, I don't want to be killing time here, but let me look for
and as we're going, we're having some questions put in chat, so after you read that, I've got some great questions for you.
Yeah, so this is a poem that I wrote. I wrote it and changed the title. The title was Solace and Repose, and it was far too abstract. I changed the title to Monuments, and I was thinking of. So here's where there's a song by Jackson Browne, one of my favorite songwriters, called "Looking Into You," where he talks about going to a house. It's a narrative where he goes to a house he used to live in, and the people let him in, and the children are playing on the floor, And he goes back outside, and he says, "It's a hotel at best. You're here as a guest. You ought to make yourself at home while you're waiting for the rest." Um, and that was when the early 17-year-old Grant was, loved it as a narrative, but then went, "Oh wait, he's talking about not the house literally, but growing old in the flesh, and it's a hotel at best, and you're waiting for the rest. You're waiting for the rest of everybody is in the context of the song, but waiting for the rest of, the end at the end of life." And there were all these different layers that hit. And so with that lyric in mind, I started thinking about my youth, and I started thinking of that metaphor. And I thought, well, my youth is something I can't see anymore, but it's there. And there's this house, there's this structure. I'm just taking you through my creative process that kind of started that was the seed for the poem. And so I wanted to write about that. And I was also really disturbed by what was happening in the country. And I didn't want it to be a blatantly political poem, but I realized that I thought of the Lincoln Memorial, and I thought of that as a monument. And I thought of those things we don't see. There's that unseen connection again. And so if you look at a penny, if you look at the Lincoln penny, not the modern one where there's, but the old one that has a Lincoln Memorial on the back. I think it stopped being minted a while ago, but they're still common, although coins are being hard to come by this year. If you look at the back, or if you can just go online and look at the back of the Lincoln penny, you see the Lincoln Memorial Monument. You see the steps going this way. You see the pillars this way. And you can see Lincoln in between the central pillars in miniature, just very, very small, especially if you zoom in. And I love that idea of our history, what was happening to our country, being unseen on the backside of a coin, and that ideal being there as well, where I didn't like what was happening. And so I used that as the metaphor, as the vehicle to talk about politics and aging and youth, and put it all together and just let it fall where it came. And so here's the poem called Monuments. The house I grew up in has slowly faded. Dull image on the backside of a coin I can no longer see has gradually become something other. Softened features, flattened monument whose meaning has been lost. Long steps, now just suggestions. If I tried to climb them now, I would go nowhere, find nothing other than a shallow relief. I'm talking about me, of course, as everyone routes the world through themselves first. The great song traveler passing through taught how the sky is anthem, how beauty is, how everywhere we look, all. Lost body of motion, of metaphor found, how a house is a body, how the body is a house, how talk of one is also talk of another. You, for instance. The house I grew up in is the flesh of my youth. Do you see now? I shouldn't say more, yet I do. My youth is the backside of a coin, lost steps. I can no longer remember what used to fill my head on restless nights. My life will be a monument to something forgotten. How we reached, how we loved among ruins. That was all. The touch of this life wears away. On the other side, a great song. Listen.
All right, fantastic. Well, I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
And Lavina asks, which poetry collections by Grant are more concerned with nature?
Hi, Lavina. Good to see you. Well, my first book is definitely one long nature poem that is also a non-overtly political poem. And the metaphorical garden, it's about this house I live in right here. Right outside my window is this tree that my mother's mother planted in the yard when my parents bought the home when I was a little boy. And then on the back is the fossil of the leaf in the concrete and the house plat. So the idea behind this poem was was really the start of my storytelling and the start of my imaginative creative writing. When I was a small boy growing up in this house, I used to play in the dirt, and then my grandparents lived on in the foothills of the Mojave, of the Western Mojave, where the San Gabriels flatten out toward the Edwards Air Force Base, that area, Lake Los Angeles. And my grandparents homesteaded out there, and they found arrowheads and some old bricks. And I asked what they were, and they said, "Oh, those are the people who were here before," and that just lit up my brain. And so I always imagined when I was digging in the dirt what I was going to find there, like what layers of soil would reveal what stories of what came before, the animals, the bones, the peoples, the cultures, whatever. That I was really just a short breath in the continuum. It was a way of self-awareness. Cut to me in graduate school, coming up with a thesis for my project in creative writing, and I thought, well, I always wanted to try the long poem form. It was hard. I've never done it. I figured I'd challenge myself, and I knew I had to have a topic that was that big. And simultaneously, I had moved back into this house where the trees are that my mother's mother planted and my father's father planted, and the handprints are in the cement for my youth. And as I was sinking fence posts, as I was digging fence holes, I was again playing in the dirt, and I saw this as a layers again. And I just then at the same time came across an essay by Gary Snyder, the poet, the beat poet, called Reinhabitation. And he has a quote about knowing the self. And to really know the self, you have to know the whole thing. And his thesis is to re-inhabit nature is really about awareness of things other than you, of other stores, of the web, of the nature in that sense of where we started this conversation of us being a part of nature and us fitting in, and yet us not owning nature. That it isn't our place. We claim the irony of me claiming a fence post as a territory parallels that whole idea of the Western takeover of and the empire, the manifest destiny, and then the history of our nation and the history of Great Britain in many ways. That this is not our land. It's the Robert Frost. The land was ours before we were the lands. It's like, what? This is a worldview that is I'm having trouble with here. I'm temporarily here, and we're missing all these stories. Where are these voices? Where are these other voices? And so rather than try to assume as the white savior that I'm going to come in and tell the stories of others, it was like, no, let me just tell the story of me trying to find the stories of others and and where it is and what we can learn. And so I'm writing about nature in the yard and the development of Southern California in verse, but from the point of view on the left. So the way I structured it is on the left-hand column margin was my limited first-person view, which is me, and then rather than to assume another culture, to just refer to those cultures that are there by way of my research and what I could learn about them, appearing then in the more recent past, including that of my parents and grandparents, stories I didn't know, and then the longer on the far right, the formation of the continents, the longer settlers, the Millingstone Horizon culture that was here, 15,000 years ago, that was, that migrated from wherever, that just leave cogstones. We know very little about it, yet this is part of the story. This is our story. This is where we live. This is the self in the grand signifier of family. So that, by microcosm, what I'm saying in this book has really been the way I've approached nature poetry. It's like, what are those connections that I'm missing? And then John and I wrote this book, which are the stories that are happening just outside of histories, not the histories that you read about by the victors, but what about the human hearts involved, and what are the stories? And they're connected by objects through that appear in different stories at different times, location, bridges, water, wells. So we use that as a narrative, but it's nonlinear. It bounces back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this was a project that took years and years and years. This book took 1 year to write the first draft, and then 20 years later is when it won the award and was published. And in the interim, I met my wife, who is Tongva Indian, part and part Mexican, and far more native to this place than I am. And then John and I took, what, 4 years on this?
Yeah, something like that. A long part of my life.
Yeah. But it was a joy because, well, first of all, it was an excuse to talk with John regularly, but also, and then meet at a restaurant and catch up. But also, the way we did it was we knew that it was a project of love and passion, and that we were doing it, fitting it in within as we could within the rest of our other commitments. And so we never we kept each other motivated and showed each other new stories, but we didn't have the pressing deadline until we had one by the publisher when we got picked up. So we let the writing be what it was, and it found its natural form. And in going back, I don't know, John, if you've gone back to it recently, but I'm really impressed by how strong the structure is.
Yeah.
Approached it,
Yeah, yeah. And most of it Flash and some of it not Flash, and really functions as it should.
Yeah, we didn't care about whether it would be called a flash fiction or not by the various definitions of flash fiction there are. Some flash fiction purists might not like some of the longer pieces because they're over the word count or whatever. But we didn't. We let the writing become what it needed to be the best writing it could.
Maybe this leads us, and Perry has a comment. I'm going to read it for them. Nature, Earth, and human physicality, embodied experience, and how they intertwine are some of my favorite themes, images, to set to work with. Brings us back to our roots, as it were. Implication is also wonderful because, implication is also wonderful, especially when using natural imagery, because humans naturally seem to tend to try and relate everything in the world to themselves. It's a great way to create that tension between nature and humans.
Yeah.
I wonder if that leads us to a prompt for participants here. Do you have a prompt, a nature prompt locked and loaded?
Well, I can think of one, and it has to do with zooming. So it's play the role of a cinematographer, as if you are behind the lens of a camera on a movie set, and you are picking the frame. What your choice is related to what you said. Nature, Earth, human, the physicality, embodied experience, and how they intertwine are some of the favorite themes. So, it's a way to do this is to think of what's implied. And I'm thinking of Edith Wharton by example to use some scaffolding here. Edith Wharton in Ethan Frome, I think it is, describes the room where Ethan lives, and it is as much a part of nature as it is about Ethan, the character. And so her cinematography lens as a writer zooms to details that are of the man-made, of the environment that person lives in, that also implies that person. And often, and the way you can think of it too is to pick something that is a dichotomy that doesn't belong there. Often, the conflict is what is in the room that doesn't fit the person. That's another way to do it. So I would say a writing prompt would be to imagine a character in an environment and write about something that's in the room to describe that character, but don't mention the character. Describe that thing that is defining that character.
Okay, so maybe 10 minutes?
Yeah.
3 minutes left. All right, we're about there. You're muted, Grant.
Gave me enough time to transcribe my scrawl.
Yeah, do you have one that you have something to share?
I just banged something out. I don't know.
Oh, that's great. And if anybody else in the room wants to share, you can, if you can raise your hand via the reactions button, that'll put you in line.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys came up with for sure. I can start. It's I don't know. It's raw. We know that. The bullied pacifist dreams of revenge, awakens with regret. Models crossbows made of crosses from graveyards, but on his computer. Never in life. Paints in ZBrush, counts X kills in his imaginary games, prays for forgiveness as he loads another arrow, his cursor's arrow turned now into a pointing finger.
Tommy.
Let's see. Central in my eye, these flesh forms circle about me. I shiver in my veins, grounded in the soil, trapped in my terracotta. I have no eye to close.
That's one of the longest poems I've ever heard from you, Tom.
I have longer.
All right. Who else would like to go? Okay, so I want to bring up something that I think we can all feel. Grant, so you are a professor, and at times you've been a dean. These are all heavy-duty jobs. And how do you mix writing with your other passion, which is teaching, or with any job?
Yeah, time management is big. Really just finding routine. I'm a creature of habit. So although this pandemic has just thrown a wrench into everything, but we have to be forgiving of ourselves, or forgive ourselves, allow ourselves to have those mistakes or those things we fall out of, especially in extraordinary times. But you know, finding the time to write is just something that I've worked into my daily schedule. And I say routine, but the most routine thing about it is the time late at night before going to bed that I write, when the house is quiet and everything is calmed down. But in between, in the minutes of the day, I will have tablets everywhere, and I like the hardback that you can flip around and it becomes a writing surface, and it has a very clean perf, so that you can tear them out and have a clean line if you want to tear them out. And I'm also left-handed, so that the fact that it lays flat is nice because I can start writing here without hitting the thing. And then I just have it around. So I'm old school. I also write texts and do memos. That's one of the things that I've recently discovered, or has turned into more of a habit. So in those spare moments of the day, I do my best to not let a thought go unrecorded when I have that idea for a story or a line. It can just be a couple words. It can be a conversation I overheard. And it's not dissimilar to an artist studio, seeing a color in a magazine and ripping it out and putting it on the wall, so that it becomes, or sticking it next to your computer, so that it becomes part of your daily consciousness, so that you think of it. And so whenever I open the notebook, I'll just start writing on the blank page. I usually won't have an idea of where it's going. And then it will turn into something else. I'll come back and I'll revise more, or I'll, and what's funny is that depending on where I open the book, sometimes it'll be on the left, this side, or if I pick up the book this way, then there'll be writing that goes that way too. So it's a non-linear journal type of thing. The book I'm currently working on, that's going to come out next year, is called Practice, 394 Poems in 365 Days. So I wrote a poem a day, and sometimes two, sometimes three, as a challenge for Poetry Month. And a poet friend said, hey, National Poetry Month, let's do a poem a day, 30 for 30 for April. And we just email it to each other it doesn't have to be formatted. We're not going to comment on it. We're just going to say, yeah, we wrote a poem today. And the first thing I thought was, no, I can't do that. I don't have time. It was like, of course you have time. You write every day. You can finish a poem every day. You can be like Tommy and not make it a long poem of 94 pages. You can make it shorter. It doesn't matter. Just, get it out. Just let the ink, keep it flowing, stay in process is the idea. I finished 30 for 30. I thought, I really dug this. How about May? And my poet friends who had challenged went, it was crickets. They went, I don't think so. But I did it. I wrote a poem a day through May and just emailed it to myself. And then June, I had momentum. July, and by about the 6th month, it was like I was in a new head, because the everyday process of writing, turning this into an actual longer discipline each day, where I actually crafted more than just spit it out. And knowing I had to write a new poem each day made my sensors turn up and tune up. It was like I was in another head. My ears were listening for that conversation fragment. I was just in a different brain, and I love that. So, and then when that book, after 365 days, actually 2 months before the end, the city of Anaheim said, you're going to be the next poet laureate. And I didn't know what that commitment would be. So I said, I'm going to stop at the year. So at the 365th day, I stopped. And then a publisher, Mark Gibbons from Pelicanesis, said, that's a book. And I said, great. And we thought at the time, oh, it's all there. We don't have to do anything. You want to print them raw? And I went, that would be interesting, kind of standing there naked without revising, because I always revise dozens and dozens of times. And I thought, no, you know what? Why not show it raw? Why not make it like that kind of book? And 365 poems, I don't know of a poetry book like that. And then the educator in me went, well, it's a missed opportunity if I'd like to tell the story of how this poem came to be, a seed prompt. And then I'd also like to talk about the form, because I was inventing different forms of craft, and I was doing diptychs. I was calling up yesterday's poem and then using that as the seed to the next poem, and it was like a photographic diptych. And it didn't have to necessarily relate to the poem before, but it could just be the sonics or something. And so I went, well, let's make that part of the lessons. I'll make an appendix of prompts. So I have an appendix of this book of all these poetry prompts that are based on the poems and then as I'm writing about it, I'm giving advice about finding those moments in the day, finding the time to write. And I started quoting all those things I've been quoting for decades in my creative writing classes, the advice from the writers. There's no one right advice for any one poet. We're all different beasts. We all come to writing differently. We all have our routines. But when you hear a smattering of advice, some of it will resonate with you. Every writer comes to it differently. So I didn't want to prescribe any way of writing. I just wanted to talk about the process of writing, the way different writers approach it, and try this, and maybe try this, and what if you do this, and here I tried this, and so this became a tome. This became a very thick book with appendices and quotes and a teaching text too. That's coming out early next year, I believe. But that's how you do it. You find those moments, and a good way to do it is to you're busy, you're working, you just make it a part. People ask, when do you have time to be the poet? And it's like, well, I don't think of it that way. I think that I'm always the poet. I'm just processing the world that way. And music I process. So the guitar is always in tune and on the wall. And when I push the microwave, I go to the guitar and I keep my calluses up. I always have the paints out. So I do that. I'll sign up for a ceramics class. I'm taking my 90-year-old mother to ceramics classes at Muckenthaler every Saturday now. And it's keeping that artistic 3D art, that tactile. But I see it all coming from the same source. I see it as just finding ways to work it into your routine. You pull into the store before you go in, give yourself 2 minutes, pick up your phone, memo, dictate a poem, whatever comes. Just stay in process.
Is the teaching a part of that artistic routine as well?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I always learn from my classes, because it's an open dialogue. I ask for my students to be themselves in their writing, whether they're writing a thesis paper, whether they're writing creative writing, and we talk about that. We talk about the process, and it's enlightening to me.
Okay, so Connie asked what the title of the book is.
Practice, 394 poems in 365 days.
And you mentioned that you had not prescription sorts of quotations, but some favorite. Could you give us that favorite advice that you got from writers?
Galway Connell, who I had the honor of working with a couple times and talking with on several occasions. He challenged us in writing workshop to try something daring and difficult. And Sharon Olds, in a similar vein, said, write the poem you cannot write. You go, whoa, what would that look like? And it just gets you to that, dropping the guard. Don't try, Bukowski. Don't try. Let it go. Trying something daring and difficult is the one that I have embraced, I think. I like challenging myself to try new. I admire the artists I most admire, that I am inspired by, are those who always try the new. The David Bowie, Picasso, because he tries new. I'm not a fan of his product necessarily, or the man, but I admire the fact that he's always pushing, always into new territory, always. Because when you do that, you develop new muscles and you grow. It doesn't have to be good. It's practice. You open the notebook and you try something,
So do you have a prompt for that? I don't know if that's possible to have a prompt for that or not.
Well, there's how is a writing desk like a blackbird? It's like you force yourself into making connections, these odd connections that you normally don't see. There it is. Take two seemingly desperate things, pick them at random, and write about their similarities. So here's a actually, before we get into the prompt, if you want a little bit more context, the poet Patty Ann Rogers is a poet I greatly admire. She is a nature poet. If you're looking for good nature poets and don't know Patty Ann Rogers' work, I would highly recommend her work. She wrote The Importance of Whale in the Field of Iris, is a great poem. And that actually inspired a series of poems that became my second book, called The Difference Between. So I would take words that sounded alike but weren't alike, or I would take two random thoughts. The Difference Between One and Reunion is one of the titles. The Difference Between This Time and Forevermore. The Difference Between Faith and Floating. And so at first blush, you go, wait, what? Faith and floating? How? What? But then when you start writing about it, you start looking actually, ironically, or for the similarities. So rather, it's not really the difference between, it's the similarities. And those are great prompts, you know. Look around your room, find two things, and write about how they're similar. That would be a good prompt.
Yeah. So we can do that. Do you want to take 10 minutes and do that? All right. So find two things and write about how they're similar. Two things in your room.
That aren't necessarily similar at first blush. Obviously similar. What is it, a 5-minute, John?
Yeah, 5 minutes would be great.
I'm going to turn off my camera for 1 minute.
One more minute. Okay. Who has something to share? I could start off. I've got my dog sitting here, and I also have my foot. So foot and dog.
All right.
My dog lies at my foot, restless in her dreams. So my foot rubs her belly, and both foot and dog are grateful for contact. Both are cheered. Both find rest in each other.
Love it.
Who's up next? It's like Tommy might be up for you. Yeah.
Okay. I got a phone call in the middle, so I only got 2 of them down. These actually have titles. Joy in motion. You in constant swirl stir the air, touch my flesh. I in my stillness tumble in your wake, delighted in you. And then wood in silence. This tree suspended in the cut makes no sound. That's the whole, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound, which is a bullshit statement. But I'd respond to it.
That also reminds me of the Basho haiku. The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers.
Huh.
I love Basho.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful.
You know,
Marianne, did you have one to share?
Why, yes, I did.
Oh, good.
I don't know how many are familiar with the artist named Grunk. His iconic image is this woman he calls Tormenta, and it's a woman. I think it's a woman. It could be a woman. And you only see her back, and she's got a V-shaped black dress on. And he calls her Tormenta. I have kind of like one of his paintings. So it's Tormenta in the crackled glass lamp. She stares out beyond curtains, looking at a ship. She could be on the Titanic, setting sail toward her new life and happiness. The crackled glass throws shadows like spirits at night when all is quiet.
love it. Love it.
Who else has one to share?
I'd love to hear him.
Okay, Lavina. Oh, you're muted.
It's a water bottle of glass underneath a gray rubbery sheath. Screw-on lid with a loop for my finger sits on the desk. The shelf, hard plastic gray, connects to supports on each end. Each takes what I pour in or stack. The bottle unchanged. The shelf with all that weight has begun to sag. The thing for holding each. An instrument for order, for arrangement. If I tipped the bottle, the water would flow out. If I tipped the shelf, all those tablets of watercolor paper, black paper, pastel paper, large envelopes, and sandpaper would spill onto the floor.
Excellent. I love the listing of the specific. Really good move. While we were in break, I found a quote that directly relates to this. I discovered it through Michael Ryan, who headed the poetry program at UC Irvine for a long time. Great poet. He talks about an essay that Ezra Pound wrote called Vorticism. and he says, if you're interested in this juxtaposition thing, he says in an uncollected early essay called Vorticism, Ezra Pound wrote that things juxtaposed create their own relationships, a technique that poets have taken to the bank and sometimes robbed it blind, which is really true. You know, we that's why the photographic diptych works so well, you know, that you see two images that are seemingly dissimilar, and yet the brain wants to make the connections, and the brain starts storytelling, and the brain, you know, we connect the dots in the stars. Speaking of sons and dogs, I didn't write this on the spot, but this is one of the difference between poems that was published in Zocalo Public Square that I wrote. My dog, Huckleberry, when he was a puppy, used to wake me up at just before dawn or a half hour before dawn. You know, and I didn't have the doggy door. I used to have to put bricks under the bed so he wouldn't crawl under the bed and get out. But he would, you know, wake up and we'd walk out and we'd do the routine. And, you know, I'm up right until late, so this was an ungodly hour for me. But just before dawn, nature has a beauty that is, you know, I certainly understand the beauty that is of nature at that hour. But Huck made me, during the time he was being puppy trained, an early riser. And so often what would happen is he'd go out and go pee, and then my cat would come out, and then the cat would try and play, and then it would be over because the dog would start playing, and then I'm awake, fully awake, and, you know. But what I noticed was this thing called dawn chorus, which was another word or phrase that I wrote in a notebook. I heard it. And it's the term used for the singing of birds just before the sun cracks the horizon, dawn chorus. And there's different theories on why that happens, but I loved it. And so I actually wrote an ekphrasis about hoppers, nighthawks at the diner, making the dawn chorus connection and the hawk nose, and I just juxtaposed those two things, back to the vorticism of Ezra Pound and the difference between essays. The two similar things that look disparate, but you start finding those similarities. So dawn chorus, anyway. The one theory is in the Amazon rainforest, the trees are way up high and they see the sunrise before other people do. And I love that. I love nature. You know, I love those. Somewhere there's a poem, and if you guys take it as a prompt, the towers in Dubai are so tall now that one beats the sunrise. So you can get on an elevator, you can see two sunsets an evening. Wow. You can see the sunset on the ground, and then take the elevator to the top and see it set again. And I just went, that's a story somewhere. So there, I give you that as a gift. Go write it and send it to me. And then when you make 1 million, send me 10%. So this dawn chorus came. So my dog comes out, we're playing, and right before the sunrise, this bird starts singing, and then the sun. And I went, this is before I knew of dawn chorus. I found it later. And I went, that sun went in the bird, and the bird sang back the sun, was my thought. And I went, oh, nature, that's something I didn't think of before. And so I wrote this poem based on that. And then I started thinking about those connectedness and being home. And so this came out. The difference between one and reunion. Because I was thinking, it's connected and it's one. If nature really is connected as one, back to that question about nature, there is no such thing as reunion, because we're always there, home, which was a theme of Untended Garden as well. It's just we don't realize it. It's the Wizard of Oz. It's an old story. It was their home all along, Dorothy. Wake up, Dolores. So the difference between one and reunion. Repeating the sunrise, the chirping bird fills itself with the world, sings it back in a puff, bob, and whistle. Cacophony to the bee and the flower, nuzzling, the thirst for more, deeper still. The head twists in a blur to clear the senses, a new realm. The first dawn must have been like this. You and I were there as star ash, scattered in atoms not yet gathered into the us we are, just a lumbering shrug of bonding here and there, perhaps a shudder of recognition of what was to come, the hum of promise the oak remembers from the tumbling cupule fall, the thump. We wait between beats, asleep as the seasons repeat like a drum, dreaming the actor into being, the play resumes. The rearrangement of ancient stories into new ones, one sunrise at a time. Lines and acts repeated, the lovers and the future assembled thus in a shimmer like a placenta spilled, or a surfacing fish. The wish for wholeness rises and shines as we lie in the dark. The thing we forget is this, the song of sun within the bird. The same arc and angle, the familiar air, the oncoming light echoed in a blur of stars between poles, the hum in the wires, the letter from home. That came out almost verbatim, just spilled.
Wow, that's great. Does anybody else have one they'd like to share? Okay, wow, that's an extraordinary poem. It's wonderful. I back in the before times, before this pandemic, when we used to have people on campus. I wanted to see your thing, but we had 6 stages going at once, and couldn't go in there. But the students came out, and they were all like, their minds were blown. They said, "Yeah, he was talking about the architecture of the mouth and how sounds relate to emotion." And I've been waiting now about 10, 15 years to hear this discussion.
I think it related to two different things. Breath architecture, that actually is a phrase that Robert Haas, the poet laureate of the United States for a couple terms, told me about. And then he wrote it in a nightly lecture, actually, up at the Community of Writers of up in Lake Tahoe. And he actually quotes Keats and La Belle Dame sans Merci, the woman without, that poem, I'm not saying the French very well, Woman Without Mercy. The night is wandering and palely loitering. And they ask him why, and he says, well, he just saw the most beautiful creature on the planet, a woman, and he made love to her. And he spent the night making love, and he got up and he got back on his horse, and now his life is ruined because that's all behind him, and he's, he had the beauty and it's gone. In describing that night, there are phrases that are beautiful. I love the zooming into the specific. She closed my eyes with kisses for, and then says at one point, she looked at me as she did love and made sweet moan, which is a pretty sexy line for the time. But then Robert House says, okay, now say it with me. So this is something you all can do. You can unmute yourself so we can all be sounding together as a dawn chorus of sorts. And boy, that's stretching a metaphor. So say, and made sweet moan.
And made sweet moan. Moan.
Now say it a little bit slower, like, and made sweet moan. And made
sweet moan.
Now we're going to slow it down even more. And made sweet moan. And made sweet moan. Now he says, be aware of what's happening in the body, the vibrations in the body. If we go, it's way down here, in the chest. And it starts tightening up here. Sweet, it starts coming to the mouth. Sweet, the teeth. We're at the alveolar ridge, unvoiced, sweet, moan. And so the M is the bilabial moan, and then the O out the mouth. He says, so what you have is an ascending ladder of sound, the architecture of sound, in one phrase. Ayo, ay moan, and made sweet moan. Great breath architecture. And it made me think about the vibrations of the body and the mouthfeel. Cannell, Galway Cannell always talks about mouthfeel and what's happening in the mouth. So when I teach when I teach on the master's level, or when I teach advanced creative writing workshops, I get into one of the things I did at a writers' weekend, or I should say a Culturama Ni writers' weekend, was a workshop on the sonics, the linguistics of what happens. And so I wrote the paired letters. And here's another exercise we can do real quickly to get us all going. Everybody make the S sound like a pipe of the compressed air escaping. Now make the sound of a BZ sound. Now put your fingers in your ears and make the S sound, and then make the Z sound. What happens? Your head vibrates with the Z. Why? Because we're employing our vocal cords. So the difference between an S and a Z, they are sisters. Everything the mouth is doing, the mouthfeel of an S and a Z is exactly the same. The only difference is we're vibrating the one. So when we whisper, we don't use our vocal cords. Hello. 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 It's whether I choose to use that tool of communication. And so often when I'm writing a poem, well, not often, when I'm revising, I practiced it so much over the years, it became part of my toolbox as a poet, as a writer. When I was looking for a ring, a resonance, I like disguising the craft. I don't like heavy-hitting craft. I've written in fixed form, but I like disguising the fixed form, so where it rhymes. Robert Wrigley is another poet I would highly suggest, who writes sometimes in rhyme, and you don't know the poem rhymes until you go back and look at it, and you go, whoa, I just read that, and because he's using enjambment, and he's being very subtle. He's using assonance instead of rhyme, which is another technique that I often use. So the idea is you can make things chime without rhyme. There I go, rhyming. So a B and a P are, so go ba, 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 and then go p, p. It's voiced and unvoiced. A B is a P. It's just you're adding your vocal cords. Or you can move far back in the throat. A g, g, g is a k, 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 G, and K, voiced, unvoiced. And then there's a third option with some letters where you can stop it back here and drive it through the nose, and it becomes the G and the K. If you stop it, you go through the nose, and it becomes an You're stopping it here, ing. So the NG is the cousin to the K, which is twin to the G. And so the mouth has all these things. B and P, peanut butter. Ongoing kangaroo killings is a phrase that I said in the workshop and handed out. And so this is a phrase I made up because it has the G, the ng, the k. So I use that sometimes. I'll look for words that are cousins that are being voiced or unvoiced to just have that little extra music in the phrase. The mouthfeel, the sonics, linguistically. Cliff Notes version.
Well, I realize I've been hogging the interview. So does anybody have any questions for the poet of Anaheim? And feel free to ask anything.
Yeah.
Sometimes a hard order for just to, yeah.
Or talk about your fears. Talk about what you worry about when you write. Talk about why you might not show a poem.
Yeah, Tommy.
You brought that up why you won't show a poem. And usually if it's about me and how screwed up I am, I'm glad to do it and throw it out there, or how screwed up I was. I don't know. But I did write one just today that I'm not going to show that one. But it was about my father and probably unresolved aspects of my relationship with him. So, it's like, oh, there is something I don't want to share.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard an Ike Turner quote. I think it's from the book Rolling Stone Book of Quotes. And it was so brutal and so upsetting to me that I wrote it down in my notebook. And it was, of course I beat my wife, but no more than any man would. Something to that effect.
Wow.
And I went, that's a character, isn't it? So I want to write about this. And so I wrote it down in my journal. And then I went, oh, what about context? Somebody's going to find my journal.
Yeah.
Think that it was, it's the smart we talked about beforehand. It's like the misunderstood. No, that's not my quote. It's like, and so there is a concern when writing in a persona that people assume that the author or the first person is the person.
Yeah.
And boy,
you talk about Ike, and there's so much talent there, and he's almost credited with probably one of the first rock and roll songs.
Yeah, 88.
But then you connect him with his ex-wife, and it's such a terrible history.
Oh, it's horrible. But he's a great musician. He has a song called Garbage Man, which I highly recommend if you can find it. It's very obscure. It's about a guy who's talking about trying to get a woman to come to his apartment, and he has a TV, and yeah, the dial's broken off, but you can come over and we'll fix it. It's a guy who has no money trying to woo a woman, who's has no. It's meant as a novelty song, I think. But do you have to like the person, or at what? I don't think I'll ever laugh at Bill Cosby again.
Yeah.
And it's just, I cannot separate the artist that I once loved. And I feel, it's going to come as a shock. I hate to ruin it, but I feel that way now about Paul Simon. He was one of my favorite of all times. And then I heard some stories about him, first person stories, and went, oh, really? And so
stories.
Yeah. So as much as I listen to Beethoven, and he was a jerk, and I don't let that bother me. But I don't know. It's a hard dilemma to separate the persona, the person from the art.
We also have a question coming in from New Zealand, from Edna, who's in New Zealand.
Hi, Edna.
She says, a question I always want to ask poets: do you find the poems that come out in a minute on their own accord better or worse, or basically no different than the poems heavily revised and edited?
Well, I can speak from my own experience, and one of the things I learned from this book, this practice of writing a poem a day, is one of the revelations that came to me was that I liked some of the poems that were on the spot as much as I liked some of the poems that I had written and revised. So before going into this 365 this year of writing poetry, I would on average revise a poem a dozen times, 24 times. I would look at it, I'd put it down. As a young writer, and often as young writers in workshops, we're so pleased that we have something we like and we think it's good, and we don't want to go anymore or push it or see what it can be because it's good. And learning the art of revision is a major step in finding one's own voice, I found. And I highly encourage going back and looking, because you always have the original. You always can save it off. But just look and start looking at each word, looking at the rhythm of it. Listen to the mouthfeel of it. Listen, do you repeat words? Is that an opportunity to replace one of the words? Or is there a way to repeat the words so that it becomes a refrain and becomes a musical device? where you want to repeat the words. All these things about rhythm and breath and the different ways of different filters you can put on to in considering a poem. Speaking it aloud is totally different than reading it off the page. Feeling the mouth, feeling the vibration of sound up the ladder of the larynx and pharynx. These are all tools that you have. If you start tuning the ear to, you become better at. And I love words. I used to read the dictionary as a little boy and etymologies, and I just loved the sound of words, and I loved the craft. And I was reading when I was 3 years old, according to my parents. I loved the language of it and the connection of it to the world. And so I loved playing. It was like a way of, it was an exercise. It was an artistic exercise and a mental exercise for me. And I loved that process of revision. And I would do it until I saw no move in the poem, put it down, pick it up. A new poem, I'd see a few moves, put it down, pick it up a week later, look, until the point where the poem, I saw no more moves and it would be done. Some poems were 100, Tom Lux, the great poet. He and I were talking, thanks to Jerry Laughlin, the connection we made. But speaking of great poets, he and I were talking about revision, and Lux said, I revise hundreds of times. And it was like, wow. And so if I looked at my revising as a double aught sandpaper of polishing away the move the comma here, change this letter, change this vowel sound, he was like quadruple aught. He was seeing things, and in workshopping, you see the things because you're that trained to that fine art of hearing it, of seeing what the untrained or the rougher points of revision are. That's where writing teachers, and that's where Culture On and these workshops can help. The people who've been doing it for so long, the great artists who've been in the studio for so long, teaching pottery or painting. So, but in part of the 365, it would be 11:30 at night. I knew I wouldn't get home to midnight. I promised myself. So on the way home, I'd pick up my phone and I'd just start talking, and I'd dictate the poem, and then I would transcribe it verbatim from the poem and email it to me. Well, sometimes I would, bless you, sometimes I would do that early in the day, and then I'd write another poem at night and forget about that. So in assembling this manuscript, I found 14 poems that I hadn't described in my phone, transcribed, that were still there, that I had written, and I typed them up and I went, no revision? These are what? And I like them. But I like them for a different reason. I think they were as good at what they did, which was capturing the emotional truth. That's one thing that I think is what makes or breaks a work for me. Does it resonate as truth? Am I trying, or am I transparent? Am I actually getting to the essence of what it is I want to say, the triggering tone, rather than the vehicle, the thing that gets me there. So yes and no. Some poems I like that come just straight out, and those are the ones that are often gifts when you're not trying, and all that craft just comes out naturally without crafting it. But the art of writing, I would say, is like the product itself. Donna Hilbert said, Donna is one of my favorite poets and people. Please buy all her books. She said, the house of poetry is large, has many rooms. And I went, yeah, these people who are dissing Instagram poets and saying, oh, that's not really poetry. They're saying the same things they said about Whitman. Oh, that's not poetry because it's not to the form that we think of as poetry now. It's not academic, it's not this, or it's too casual, or it's too, well, look at the Black Mountain poets are talking like they're answering a phone. It's not rhyming, it's not what we teach in academia, and yet, so there's sensibilities of poetry. It's not for everybody, but they're all in the house of poetry. I can go to the Gertrude Stein room and go, okay, I've had enough, thank you, Gertrude, I love the rhythm, but I'm going to go hang out in this room because I like this. But it's all a house. And so by extension, to really extend the metaphor, so is the writing process. I have great poems that I really revised, and it fulfills a certain part of me. as an artist and a writer and a human that I get from that mental exercise of revision. And yet those quick spoken poems are also beautiful. It's like playing music in an instrument. It's a big house. There's different ways to do it. I heard a great quote by Bruce Springsteen. I'm dating myself, but he got criticized for writing or sounding like his one of his songs he wrote on an album sounded like his 17-year-old self or his early. And he went, I'm an old man behind the wheel, but that 17-year-old's in the car with me, and that 30-year-old's in the car who wrote that song, and we're all here. And sometimes he sings, and sometimes the other person sings, and it's all me. And I'm like, yeah. It's like sometimes my old voice comes out, sometimes the revision voice comes out. So that's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I wouldn't say better or worse. I wouldn't put that value judgment on it. I would say that they serve different purposes. Which is better or worse? Asparagus fried in olive oil with salt and pepper, or a quick fried zucchini. Oh, they're totally different, but they're both pretty good.
I've got a story that I sometimes tell about you in the revision, and it's like you were working on an untended garden, and you had this 20 years of revision, and you and I are having a conversation about 10 years into it. I said, "Wait, you got to put this out. This is you can't keep it." It's like, no, I got to work on it some more. Like, oh, that's terrible. And then you win the prize Americana. It's like, so, well, you were right. I was wrong. I mean, but do you think it's just dependent on the poem?
I do. And, this poem was so big, the prize Americana poem, it took me that long to get the poem to that degree. It was so much text, and it was, if you write a 90-page poem, a 95-page poem, and you write it all the same way, you're gonna numb the brain of the reader or the audience. Their eyes will cross and they'll go, oh, that's enough of that rhythm. So it's like conducting music. It's like you orchestrate the pacing of it, the mouthfeel of it, the sound of it, the different elements of poetry, the back and forth dialogue, the time frames. So you go in and out, and it's like a relief. It's like a movie. It's like a song, a symphony. There's different movements and different pacings and different breaths. And it took that long because it was that much body of work. If the thesis I wrote, the first draft was good, but it wouldn't have won Prize Americana, and it wouldn't have accomplished half of the things that I think the polished form did. But by extension, yeah, you can work a thing to death. You can, and you can also have these things in you that are self-defeating and don't want to get it out. The person who delays their graduation for 8 years because it's just not finishing it off, just for other reasons. I have come to the attitude to not to be easy on myself, and to not worry. John and you and I talked about this. Let's let California Continuum be whatever it is. Let it find its own shape, its own form, and let's not worry. Let somebody else put a label on it. We start with flash fiction, and we start with our idea of what you and I wanted to accomplish personally, which is tell those stories, to do good in the world. We made a list of our goals, which are the things that Rodolfo Anaya, the novelist who wrote Bless Me Ultima, told me once. Grant, you're writing too blatantly. You're stating your theme, and I'm going, but he's going, take that, put it on a Post-it, put it next to your notebook. I tell my writers, put it on a Post-it next to your screen, get it out of your manuscript. It'll find its way in. So it's like find, the Hugo triggering town. Find out what the real thing is that you want to say without having to hit it so hard on the head. Don't worry about, let other people sort out what things are called or what form it takes. I'm not one that you have to write to this thing. I like inventing new forms. I like hybrids. I like installation art. I like music that's blended with art, with, you know, I like the hybrids. Back to our original discussion before the Zoom.
All right. Does anybody else have a question for Grant?
That was a great question, by the way, Edna. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can end out then with if you want to read some poems and just however many you like, and yeah.
I would be happy to. I already read a new one. Here's a poem that is made up of tankas, 57577, and I just had each one a stanza, which is another prompt that you guys can do after we sign off. Write a poem of tanka stanzas. Across the town, bell splashes awake. Waves pulse the sky to vibrate, all flesh near. Each leaf hung, the tone transposed, hums now within, drives both sap and blood. Traffic floods the roads, before work, at noon, at 5. Cars take turn merging, regardless of each driver's religion or politics. The waitress takes home the newspaper left behind in the booth, kicks off her shoes that night, feels the toll, solves the puzzle, curls her hair. Morning doves rest like notes on the same power line the scavenger rat ran all last night. Lights change. We find a way to share this world. So I just thought, you know, I like the idea of the same scene. This is kind of like of California Continuum, the same space occupied by different people at different times, the stories that occur at the same booth, that occur in the same reader of the same newspaper. The movie The Red Violin uses the same technique. It follows the thing through. And then, because it was a 365, I wrote that. I called it on the next day. This was on my screen. I went, okay, I'll write a poem with this as the seed. So I went, okay, across the town. What would be a parallel? Across, okay, along the town. What's the opposite of town? The wild. What's different? Okay, along the wild. Okay, so that's my title. And now, bell splashes awake is the first line, and I went, creek splashes, snake. And then I went, oh, I'm a syllable short if it's going to be a haiku. Snake track. And then, so waves pulse the sky to vibrate was the first poem. I went, waves pulse the sandy banks with, and then I just used that. I just look and use it as a seed and let the words go wherever they went. And I came up with a poem of tanka stanzas that is a diptych. And I never would have gotten to this poem had I not just used that as a prompt, sonic prompt. So I'll read that poem too. Along the wild. Creek splashes, snake track waves pulse the sandy banks with fresh patterns. Each note sung here. Bones exposed from snow melts. The hives will hum here soon. Havoc of roadkills punctuate the blacktop. Life has no rehearsal. Cars reflect the driver's grief, collisions of verses. We wait for the one who's patient and kind, but in truth, we fight. We scoff at gentleness, seek to find hardness within, curse the weak. Worker bees protect the queen in winter, her fine piping. They cluster, flutter to keep her warm. We find a way to bear this world. So you can see, we find a way to share this world, we find a way to bear this world. They were all just a dialogue between the sonics of the metrics of what was happening. And then I just made it fit as a narrative. You know, I didn't know what the narrative would be. I just used that as a free flow. So where to go? Shall I read another?
Yeah, please.
Here's a poem. There's 3 different things. I'll give a little preface. Well, no, I'll do it after that. It's called Unforeseen Consequences. And my goal here was just concision, how something that Tommy's better at than I am. I tend to run long at the mouth, but how to say it in few gestures. Unforeseen consequences. The jagged line of the crack in the pot, once repaired, became the strongest spot. The hungry one got hungrier, but by knowing that pain, became more giving. Where the bag was torn, the seeds escaped. Now flowers lined the path where the poor man walked. So the first is a reference to kintsugi, which is the ceramics. When you break a pot and you fill it up with the crack line with a lacquer that is coated in a fine metallic or gold dust. And so you see the broken pot repaired, and then that becomes more valued than the original pot. And the crack is now the strongest spot of what was once damaged. And I love the idea of that. The second verse refers to Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, who says it's not what happens to someone that determines their character, it's how they react to what happens. That we all have catastrophe, we all have grief, but it's how we react to that is what determines our character. And so that was the hungry one got hungrier, but by knowing that pain became more giving. The person who's bullied and gets beat up will never bully or beat up someone because they know the pain of being bullied or beat up. The hard lessons won. And then the last one was where the bag was torn, the seeds escaped. Now flowers lined the path where the poor man walked was a Jesuit priest, Bob Brophy's friend, Michael Sasso. I traveled to Tibet with Bob, and we were talking. He became a Taoist priest and then a Buddhist priest, and he was also a Jesuit priest. And so he knew all these parables, and he told me about the parable of the man with the sack and it had a hole in it, and he thought his fortune was horrible. It's a Taoist parable. But then, after the rains, flowers everywhere he walked. So the unforeseen consequence, this poem. Here's one I don't know what it means. I kind of know what it means, but I just had fun with it. You can talk about things that finding two things in the room that aren't related and make them relate. This is femme fatale as applied to food. The fish will be most remembered as its corpse upon the plate, or recalled through the years as the Valentine's Day dinner he made, despite its entire life of swimming in the sea. The fowl gets photographed dead as well, on a skewer over fire, but suspended in the air, at least a more fitting end for a bird. And it will fly once again, but as a series of zeros and ones in code when that pic gets sent from a smartphone, then uncoded and uploaded to become a post on Instagram. Not as a chicken, but as shish kebab. The steer is not remembered for its dusty days on the ranch, nor the pig in the sty, nor the egg in the coop. Yet all are recalled as the breakfast special, and whatever's left over, just soup.
I love that last rhyme. That's fantastic.
I can't get away from rhyme. It's I wrote the first 12 years what I thought was poetry. This is like from the age of 7 to, no, even younger than that. But I was just writing song lyrics. I was writing the, Beatles lyrics transposed and writing to the meter of song lyrics. And it wasn't until I started studying poetry later that I learned the devices of poetry. But what was ingrained in me was 12 years of rhyme and rhythm, and I can't get away from it. I've written a couple times, too many rhymes in me. But it became part of my aesthetic. It's just there's that natural rhyme and rhythm there. I'll go to another book. Here's flash fiction. Here's a poem that became a piece in this book. And it's a hybrid between, I think, a narrative and a poem. The balance of the table. Juan rises in darkness, dresses in silence, prepares 7 breakfasts with barely a sound so as not to awaken those loved ones still sleeping. Small hands, rough and marked but gentle as water. He draws a flower for each seat at the table, to be discovered later when they rub their eyes, grinning. He knows that they will compare every petal, each face in the center, smiling. For now he considers each one with a nod, recovers those dreamers whose blankets have slipped off, kisses each forehead, whispers a prayer. Then he packs up 3 meals, a small pad and paper, and leaves for the bus that will take him to work. 2 jobs, back to back. He is building up more wealth for the ones who will pay him, he knows this. The ones with their daily bar charts showing profits. But he will bring back his own, too, for his own, for his family at home. And for those at the older table he left when he was young, he will do what he has always done and mail them what he's able. So you can hear the real poetry, the rhyme coming out at the end.
Yeah, you know, I've read that story, I don't know how many times. I'd never noticed the rhyme before because I wasn't reading it out loud.
And actually, if you break it down, it's in meter.
Oh, wow.
And yet, in reading it, it's not. You know, that's what I mean by one of my aesthetics is I try to bury the craft, try and make it where someone won't know that it's in the rhythm and meter and rhyme. But there it is. You know, it sounds like prose, but it's there. It's buried. I'll read one from Similitude. We're getting on the hour. This is another book. This is my 3rd book. And here's the connections. Here's a bathroom window pebble glass that look like clouds. Things that are similar but different. So this is exterior, interior. Then birds on a wire, cloudy sky, and birds in a bird bath with a broken off bird and a bird in flight. Here's the bark of the tree in my front yard. And here's a telephone pole outside the screen of the window, wood, tree transformed. And then here's the ocean, the source of life, all the symbolism, and a box of pastel. Yeah, man. Let's hear it for the arts. Here's that ekphrasis, Nighthawks and Dawn Chorus. I mentioned Dawn Chorus, so it just opened up. This is the ekphrasis I wrote to Edward Hopper's Nighthawks at the Diner after having heard of the term Dawn Chorus. So I started thinking about bird, that them at the counter is almost like things perched on a branch, the people on the counter, and I'm just making these connections in my mind, whether they're you know, obvious or not. That was what drove it. Slaked and sated, we balance on the last leg of the night. Hoisted one final glass and settled in with whispers. I dreamed of whistling feathers overhead in the darkness. You kicked a limb in your dream. The bird perched strangely sideways, looked down the branch as if a long bar glowing, leading into a new song. In morning's slow slide across the bed, we decided, laughing and rolling, that the first leg out and off the edge, the bold maker of coffee and slicer of melon, would be the one to have their say for the rest of the day. No one would know how the Hopper poem influenced it, but it's there.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great hour and 45. We're coming up. Next, we're going to have T. Carson. He's coming on at 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Right now it's 2:48 Pacific Standard Time. So please come back and join us this evening. You'll see one of the great. It'll be a whole bunch of fun prompts. All right.
That's really great. T. Anders is great. Can we save the chat? Everyone, just email me. I think my email is part of the screen there. You can see ghire@lcad.edu. Feel free to keep this conversation going. You won't be bugging me if you have any questions or anything about it. It would be great. And it's good to see some familiar faces. I've seen you all in different readings and different places, and it's been great. Thank you so much for having me, you guys. Thank you, Lloyd.